She walked into court to fight for justice, only to be humiliated by the very judge who once mentored her. Now she's been handed the power to investigate him. But can she stay true to justice when revenge feels so close? If this story grabs your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Now let me take you back to the moment it all began. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but sharp, waiting, watching. Avery Mitchell stood tall behind the plaintiff's table, her notes neat, her voice steady. She was representing a young black mother in a civil suit, wrongful eviction, mishandling of evidence, and a complete disregard for due process. Across the bench sat Judge Whitmore. He didn't look at the case file. He looked at Avery, and then, with the faintest curl of the lip, he spoke. "Well, Miss Mitchell, I assume this is another emotional crusade, not a legal argument." The words landed like a slap, but it was the way he said them. Cold, disdainful. Like her presence in his courtroom was a disruption to the natural order of things. Avery took a breath, calm, controlled. "Your Honor, the argument is grounded in precedent." He cut her off. "You can spare me the lecture. I know you people love making noise." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Avery's client looked down, ashamed, humiliated, but Avery didn't flinch. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't argue. She simply placed her papers back into her briefcase, nodded once, and said, "No further comments, Your Honor." The session adjourned. As she turned to leave, her eyes met his. Just for a second. No tears, no anger, only a stillness, like the eye of a storm yet to arrive. He smirked, dismissing her with a glance, already moving on to the next case. But Avery, she walked out with a silence that said more than words ever could. She wasn't done. Not even close. That night, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked, lights blinked in distant apartment windows. But Avery couldn't move. She sat at her kitchen table, still in her courtroom blazer, staring into the dark surface of her cold tea. His voice still lingered. "You people love making noise." She closed her eyes, and there he was again. Not the man on the bench today, but the one from years ago. It was the summer after her second year of law school. She'd been accepted into a selective mentoring initiative for minority students, one of only 8 chosen. Every Friday, they gathered in a quiet corner of the courthouse library. They read case files, debated rulings, and once a month they were allowed to shadow a real judge. Judge Whitmore had been the first. He walked in that morning wearing a gray suit and carried no notes, just his reputation. A towering figure known for strict rulings but rare insight. The other students whispered when he entered, but Avery sat up straighter. She'd read his essays, quoted him in her scholarship application. She remembered how he called her by name before she even introduced herself. "Ms. Mitchell," he'd said, flipping through her mock appellate brief. "You write like someone who knows what silence feels like." That startled her, because he was right. After the seminar, she stayed behind, her notebook hugged to her chest. "Judge Whitmore, how do you keep going when you're not invited to the table?" He didn't pause. He looked her square in the eyes and said, "You don't ask for a seat. You sharpen your voice until they can't ignore you. Be sharper than the silence that greets you." She never forgot that. In the years that followed, whenever she faced a dismissive client, smug opposing counsel, or a clerk who refused to say her name right, she'd hear that voice again. She'd believed it had come from someone who saw her. But tonight it felt like all of it. Every word, every glance, had been a performance. "Was I wrong about him?" She said it aloud, needing to hear it. "Was I just convenient for his legacy back then?" She looked over to the framed photo on the shelf, her and her mother at graduation, her mother's hand on her shoulder, proud, exhausted. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to get her there, and Avery had promised she'd never waste that sacrifice on resentment. So no, this wouldn't be about vengeance. But the truth deserved to be seen, even if it came wrapped in pain. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up the Code of Judicial Conduct, and started reading. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning. Avery had barely poured her second cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, courthouse area code. She hesitated. Something in her gut told her this wasn't about a missed filing or a client emergency. She answered. "Miss Mitchell," a voice said, low and steady, "this is Chief Judge Eleanor Bradford. I'd like to speak with you, privately." They met in Judge Bradford's chambers that same afternoon. No assistants, no formalities, just two women, separated by age, rank, and history, but somehow standing on the same side of something unspoken. Judge Bradford had a quiet dignity, the kind that didn't need to prove anything. Her eyes studied Avery, not like an opponent, but like a mirror. "I watched the hearing last week," she began. "I saw how you handled it. Calm, focused. You didn't flinch." Avery stayed silent. She didn't need praise. She wanted the reason. Bradford continued, "You should know, there have been murmurs about Judge Whitmore for years. Nothing ever stuck. No one ever spoke loud enough, or stayed long enough." She slid a file across the desk. "We're creating a temporary oversight role. Special counsel to judicial ethics. Independent, discreet. I want you to take it." Avery stared at the file but didn't touch it. Her heart beat slower now, not faster. Her instincts sharpened like they always did when the stakes shifted. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Judge Bradford leaned back. "Because you've lived in rooms that weren't built for you, and you never asked for permission to belong, because you won't be afraid to see what others choose to ignore." The words struck something deep, something rooted in years of silence she'd swallowed, microaggressions she'd learned to brush off, and injustices too small to report but too constant to forget. Still, she hesitated. Taking this role meant walking into a battlefield, alone, no firm behind her, no shield of neutrality. It meant investigating one of the most powerful judges in the district, and maybe losing everything she'd built if it went wrong. But then she thought of her mother, working nights, counting tips, pressing Avery's wrinkled suit before job interviews. She thought of her clients, mothers like Erin Taylor, who never had the luxury of being cautious. And she remembered that voice in her head. "Be sharper than the silence that greets you." She finally reached for the file. It felt heavier than paper, like a weight passed down meant for her to carry, not because she was ready, but because she could. Looking up, she nodded once. "I'll do it." No fanfare, no speech, just a decision made in silence, backed by something unshakable. That's how revolutions begin, quietly. It wasn't just another day at the courthouse. Avery knew that the moment she stepped out of her car, the air felt different, charged, expectant, not loud, but electric. She walked past the marble pillars with calm steps, her heels tapping against the polished floor like a measured drumbeat. No longer the attorney waiting outside the chambers. This time, she was walking in. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet conversations. Judges in robes, clerks checking rosters, a few sideways glances from familiar faces. It was a rare, full assembly of the district judiciary. They gathered quarterly, but this one had a new agenda. At the center stood the long oak table where the new special counsel would be introduced, where she would be introduced. Avery stood near the door for a moment, letting the room breathe around her. Then she stepped forward. Heads turned, the conversation stopped, and then Judge Whitmore saw her. His expression didn't shift at first, not dramatically, but his eyes, they flickered. Recognition, disbelief, then something colder, unease. It was the look of a man watching a ghost from a past he thought he buried. Avery didn't flinch, she didn't smirk. No trace of revenge touched her face, only poise, measured, still. Chief Judge Bradford rose. "Colleagues, I'd like to formally introduce Miss Avery Mitchell. She'll serve as our new special counsel on judicial ethics and oversight." Polite nods, a few murmured acknowledgments. Some faces warm, some tight. Avery stepped forward to speak. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "I'm honored by the trust placed in me," she began, her tone even. "I come here not just as an officer of the court, but as someone who believes in its promise." She paused, her eyes moving across the room. Not lingering, but deliberate. When they met Whitmore's, she didn't blink. "Justice must begin at the bench," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "Because if the foundation is cracked, the verdict never stands." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Judge Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair. His fingers tapped once against the table, a small unconscious movement. Avery noticed, but gave no reaction. She gathered her notes, nodded to Bradford, and stepped back. No grand gesture, no call-out, no need to name the man who once belittled her in front of strangers. The truth was already sitting in the room, visible to anyone who chose to see. And that was enough, for now. The office they gave her was small, just a desk, a worn bookshelf, and a single window that overlooked the back of the courthouse. But Avery didn't need a view. What she needed was the truth. And it was buried in boxes. Files, dozens of them. Some thick, some barely clipped together. All complaints. All dismissed, some anonymous, others desperate. Each marked with the same cold stamp, no further action recommended. She started reading, one by one, late into the night. Some were too vague to hold weight, others clearly angry but unfocused. But then, patterns began to emerge. Similar wording, recurrent names, and a common thread. Judge Whitmore. He hadn't just humiliated her in court, he'd built a quiet legacy of subtle, unchallenged decisions, overruling appeals made by single mothers, disproportionately sentencing black defendants, throwing out claims before they ever saw light. Then came the file with the name she wouldn't forget. Aaron Taylor. The report was thin, just 3 pages. The official note read, custody granted to father. Mother deemed emotionally unstable, lacking cooperative attitude. But something about that phrasing, it felt off. Avery requested the full case transcript. The next day it arrived. She read every word. Erin Taylor was a 28-year-old black woman, working 2 jobs, raising a 6-year-old boy. She'd missed 1 court-ordered parenting class due to a double shift. The father, with a spotless appearance and a good lawyer, had pushed for full custody. Whitmore granted it, swiftly, without testimony from Erin's counselor or community support letters. But it was a line in the transcript that stopped Avery cold. This court needs compliant mothers, not mouthy ones. The words belonged to Whitmore. Avery's hands tightened around the pages. She couldn't see Erin's face, but she knew that voice, that condescension dressed as order, that judgment masked as law. And suddenly, Avery understood. This wasn't about a man with prejudice. This was about a system that allowed it to thrive. A system that rewarded silence. That expected people like Erin, and like herself, to be grateful for whatever sliver of justice they were offered. That night, Avery didn't sleep. She stood by the window of her apartment, watching the lights across the city blink out one by one. She thought of Erin's son, growing up without her warmth. Of every woman who had sat across from a bench, holding her truth in trembling hands and been told she didn't matter. Avery wasn't angry. She was awake. This was no longer personal. It was structural. And now she had the power to look deeper. Not to destroy, but to expose. Quietly, relentlessly, thoroughly. Because justice doesn't start with shouting. Sometimes it starts with listening. And Avery Mitchell had just begun to listen, closer than ever before. Power doesn't scream. It whispers in hallways. It moves behind closed doors. And this time, it moved fast. Just 2 weeks into her review, Avery received an official letter, thin, formal, and laced with intent. Inside, Judge Whitmore had filed a counterclaim, conflict of interest, personal bias, abuse of temporary authority. In it, he questioned her qualifications, her neutrality, and, most insidiously, her motives. She appears to have a personal vendetta, it read. Her conduct shows an alarming lack of judicial respect. It was an elegant insult, polished, precise, designed to look like procedure, but Avery could feel the venom beneath every line. She placed the letter down without flinching. But inside, something shifted. The next day, whispers began. Not loud, not direct, just enough. In the cafeteria, someone cleared their throat when she walked in. In the hallway, 2 clerks went silent as she passed. Even the warmth from Judge Bradford felt dimmer, guarded, like she too had been warned. Emails from senior judges suddenly went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. The weight of isolation crept in, not as a wave, but as a slow tightening of space. And then came the headlines. Small legal blogs at first, then a conservative op-ed. Activist in counsel robe? Is justice becoming personal? Avery didn't respond. Not in public, not online. She knew that defending herself in the media would only confirm the story they wanted. Still, she felt the pressure rising. Alone in her apartment, she reread her notes. Page after page of testimonies, transcripts, buried complaints. Each one a voice she had promised to represent. Aaron Taylor, the anonymous clerk, the paralegal who'd been demoted for refusing to shred evidence. She had the truth. But the truth, she realized, was only as strong as the hands holding it. And right now, they were trying to make her drop it. The weight of it all pressed in, until she remembered something her mother used to say, on nights when the lights were cut off, when the rent was late and the world felt rigged. They can surround you, baby. Just don't let them shrink you. So the next morning, Avery dressed a little slower, chose her navy suit, the one her mother bought her before her first court appearance, braided her hair tight, walked through those courthouse doors as if the walls were watching, because they were, and she let them. But she did not bow. She walked past Judge Whitmore in the hallway. He nodded, smug, certain that the smear was working. Avery held his gaze, not with anger, but with something colder. Endurance. She didn't need to fight him in the hallway. She had the facts. And her silence was getting sharper by the day. Some shifts don't happen in courtrooms. They happen in whispers, in inboxes, in conscience. It was a Thursday afternoon when she saw his name in her inbox. Luis Romero. No subject line. Just one sentence. Can we talk? Privately. Avery stared at the screen for a full minute. Luis. Judge Whitmore's former clerk. Sharp, quiet, meticulous. They'd barely crossed paths, but she remembered him as someone who knew when to speak and when not to. They met in a corner booth of an old diner far from the courthouse. Luis looked thinner than she remembered, a little worn, like he hadn't slept well in weeks. He didn't touch his coffee. I shouldn't be here, he began. Avery didn't rush him. She just nodded. Luis reached into his bag and pulled out a small folder. No label, no markings. Inside were printed email exchanges, dozens of them, between Whitmore and several senior court officers. Subject lines like case priority, non-compliant witnesses, watch this one. But it wasn't just the content. It was the tone. Dismissive. Coded, sometimes not coded at all. One email forwarded from Whitmore read, "Plaintiff is one of Bradford's diversity darlings. Handle with minimal attention." Another said, "Don't waste time on the loud ones. They're just looking for a soundbite." And then in one dated just 6 months prior, in reference to a young black attorney arguing a housing case, "We need less of that street law energy in here." Avery closed the folder slowly. Her pulse didn't spike. Her hands didn't shake. But her breath caught, just for a second. Luis looked down. "I kept them because I thought maybe one day someone would need them. But I was afraid. Whitmore, he has people and a long memory." Avery spoke for the first time. "Why now?" Luis didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "Because when I saw your name in the headlines and the way they turned it on you, I realized I've been helping this system by staying quiet, and I can't anymore." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. She placed her hand gently on the folder, looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. Not with drama, not with tears, but with something far more powerful, conviction. He gave a short nod, stood, and left. She sat there for a long time, the folder still unopened on the table before her. This wasn't just evidence. This was the key. The kind that doesn't break doors open, but unlocks them quietly, deliberately. Avery walked out of that diner into the cold air, holding the folder like a lit match in a dark room. She didn't smile, but she knew. The tide was about to turn, and this time, they wouldn't see it coming. The hearing room was colder than usual, not by temperature, but by tension. Avery stood at one end of the long conference table, a neat binder in front of her. Across from her sat Judge Whitmore, flanked by a high-profile attorney and 2 fellow judges who had long backed his decisions. Quietly, but consistently. The committee had gathered. 7 members. Neutral, at least on paper. Judge Bradford presided, her face unreadable. Whitmore looked composed, almost bored. He adjusted his cufflink as if this were just another procedural annoyance. His attorney began the counteroffensive immediately. "Miss Mitchell has shown consistent bias against Judge Whitmore, and her role as special counsel is compromised by personal grievance. Her actions are not those of an impartial investigator, but of a former mentee turned adversary." The words were sharp, rehearsed, meant to poke at every weak spot in Avery's armor. But she didn't flinch. When it was her turn, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't pace, she didn't lecture. She opened her binder and began. Exhibit A. Email dated October 3rd, 9:14 a.m. Subject line case priority. In it, Judge Whitmore refers to a plaintiff as loud and ideological. The plaintiff's name was Aaron Taylor. She handed the printout to the committee, waited. Exhibit B, custody case transcript, page 17, line 6. Quote, "This court needs compliant mothers, not mouthy ones." There was a pause, a shift in the room. Avery continued. Section 3.02 of the Judicial Conduct Code clearly states that a judge shall avoid statements or actions that display bias or prejudice based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status, both in and outside of rulings. her voice never wavered. She cited 4 additional cases, 3 separate complaints buried under administrative error, 2 corroborating emails from Luis Romero. Then she paused, not for effect, but for breath, measured, in control. And lastly, a quote from Miss Taylor herself, shared with me in a private interview. "He didn't just take my son, he made me feel like I didn't deserve to be a mother." Silence, not forced, not theatrical, just truth, settling into the room like dust that had been waiting years to fall. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. His attorney whispered something, but for the first time, he didn't look bored. He looked cornered. Across the table, Bradford folded her hands. "Do you have anything further, Miss Mitchell?" Avery closed her binder. "No, Your Honor. The facts speak for themselves." And they did. No anger, no vengeance, just clarity. For a long moment, no one said a word, because sometimes the power of truth isn't in how loudly it's spoken, but in how impossible it becomes to ignore. The decision came in a single envelope, delivered without ceremony. Judge Leonard Whitmore, suspended pending further review. All scheduled cases reassigned, no press conference, no dramatic exit, just a quiet removal, swift, sterile, and absolute. Avery stood by the window of her office, looking out at the same courthouse that once looked down on her. The weight of what had happened hadn't fully settled, not as triumph, not as relief, just a shift in the air. Something old had been broken open. That afternoon, she received a message. Whitmore had requested to see her. She hesitated. Not out of fear, out of respect for the silence she had fought to reclaim. But something in her knew this chapter couldn't close without a final word. They met in the private judge's chamber, a place lined with old books and older portraits. He sat behind the desk, no robe now, just a man in a suit, suddenly smaller than the shadow he used to cast. He looked at her for a long time. "I don't hate you," he said finally. His voice was lower than she remembered. "I fear you, because you are the future. And I've built my life in a world that wasn't made to survive people like you." Avery didn't respond right away. She simply met his eyes. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She only said, with a quiet that felt heavier than thunder, "Justice doesn't roar, it reforms." She turned and left, her steps calm, measured, each one a closing door behind her. Weeks later, the courthouse lobby looked almost the same marble floors, same dull lights. But something had changed. Aaron Taylor stood by the entrance, arms wrapped tight around her son. He giggled, clinging to her like he didn't want to let go. She smiled, not the kind born from winning, but from being seen, being heard. Avery watched from a distance. She didn't interrupt. Not every victory needs a witness. Then, from the side hallway, a young black woman, barely out of law school, walked toward the courtroom doors. Her steps were unsure, but her back was straight. Briefcase in hand, chin slightly lifted, she paused, looked up at the seal above the courtroom, then pushed the door open. Avery exhaled, softly. The future had arrived, not loud, not sudden, bookmark, but undeniably here. And it had her voice. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story. Your support means the world to us. It gives our team the motivation to keep creating meaningful content that matters. Thank you for listening.